This is our last program of this season, and as always, we would like to thank St. Anne Catholic Church, MCAT, for doing the recording of the programs, and Walter and Joe, who do the sound so well for us. We really appreciate it. Please help yourself to coffee and cookies at any time, and the bathrooms are behind the petition over here on this wall. I do have the pleasure of reminding you that as soon as the program is over, the St. Anne Parish is serving a pasty dinner. If you haven't had a chance in the last 2 years to participate in this, you're in for a treat. You can eat them here or take them with you if you can't stay. And they're $5 per pasty, or a dinner is $7. And then at 4:30, the Lutheran Church right next door is having their first community concert, and they've got a lot of wonderful musicians lined up. It's free, but they are taking a free will offering to benefit the Bonner Music Department over at the school. So that's a much appreciated for them. So I'm going to turn it over to Dennis Sain now, who will get our program underway.
Well, I don't have too much to say, except we have a very distinguished group of people here who, don't give that. And so I will introduce Barry Hicks, who will kind of command the whole performance here. So have at her, Barry.
Thanks. Dennis, and I assume we're going to wait till the end of the program to pass the mic around for questions. Is that right? Okay.
That's fine.
And so I'm going to start off, and Sandy, if you want to advance to the introduction slide. My name is Barry Hicks, and I trained as a smoke jumper in 1964, so I'm a relatively young guy. And then I went on, jumped for about 10 years, and then got a regular job, and spent some time as a district ranger, and finished up here in Missoula as the regional aviation officer. And so that was my career. And each one of these guys, when they get up here to talk, is going to introduce themselves and what they did and how they got involved in this. And the video that we had playing at the first, we're going to show that at the end, and Boyd Burtch will be talking about that and answering questions right at the end about that but any of the questions that you have that comes up during the meeting, if you can hold them till the end, that'll help us a lot. All right, Sandy? I'm going to start off with the real early history, the stuff before 1900, and how the fire service got started and how that turned into the smoke jumper program. And let's go to the next one. Theodore Roosevelt set aside 151 million acres, which is a fairly sizable chunk of land. And along came Gifford Pinchot, who was a European-trained forester, and brought that idea to the United States. And those of you that know a little bit about the Bonner Mill history will understand how, when we came into those many millions of acres of timberland, that it spawned the need to try to harvest that wood and make something out of it. Okay, Sandy. So then we got into actually creating the Forest Service in 1905. And let's go to the next one, Sandy. I'm going to speed through these. And now this is the one that I wanted to spend a little time on. And you'll see that this was a statement that was made in 1907. And there are a lot of people that still believe that that's true. Even though we've proven that fallacy is not true for the last, how many years is that? Fred, you're good at math. About 100 and some odd years that we've proved that you can't give us enough money, man, and equipment to put out all the fires. We're pretty sure that's the case. And Smoke Jumpers did a great job of trying to do that, but that just didn't work. Okay, so along comes 1910. Forest Service was born in 1905. 1910 comes along and burns, take a look at that now, over 3 million acres. And right in our neck of the woods. Killed 85 people, did a lot of destruction, and so we're watching these fires that we're having today thinking that these are really unusual events. Well, those guys that had that 1910 fire thought that that was a fairly unusual event at the same time. It was before climate change had occurred, right? So pretty quick we got the mission defined. So we start building ranger stations and guard stations. And let's go to the next one. Lookout towers. We put in telephone lines. That's not a very good picture of a telephone pole, but a person up there hanging number 9 wire for crank telephones. We had communications, and so that was a big deal to have communications. Then we built roads and trails and bridges. So now we got an infrastructure that you can begin to think that if you give us more money, we can put out all the fires. And so we trained up the CCCs to help us, and they did a really good job. And for a number of years we were doing well. And then along comes World War II in 1940. We're learning more about airborne kinds of things, and I'm going to turn this over to Roger Savage, who's going to tell you about more of this. Okay, Roger? And I'm going to move my chair out of the way. I'll come back.
I'm Roger Savage. I jumped out of Missoula for 8 years between 1957 and 1966. And like a lot of jumpers, we kind of gravitated towards aviation, having been around the Smokejumper organization. I ended up flying in the service, and then I came back to Montana. I was in the Montana Guard flying for them. And I hired on with United Airlines and retired from United in 1997 as an international relief pilot. Now I'll start off by with a few pictures. Okay, we got the first one here. This, my section here for my discussion is the early flying in Smokejumpers, the 40s and the 50s. And 1940 was an important year. It had several things that were unique to it. The previous picture, which was a Ford tri-motor, and the Travel Air there, those two were the airplanes that were used those first few years. The Ford would carry 8 jumpers, all their gear, and a spotter. The spotter would go along with each requested fire and throw out a drift streamer to find out which way the wind's blowing, and then he could spot the jumpers in the appropriate place. And so this is a Ford tri-motor carrying 8, and this is a Travel Air that carries 2 jumpers and a spotter and all their gear. Okay, the next picture. Now, this is a picture that was taken in 1937 of the first airport in Missoula. It was called Hale Field. And in this picture you can see the fairgrounds, and it looks very much like it does today. This is Malfunction Junction right here, Brook Street going right along here, South Avenue, and Russell. And the airport was just right here to the east of the south and east of the fairgrounds. The runways, one here, and a third one right here. The Johnson Flying Service hangar is right here. You can see a Ford tri-motor down there. And although the fairgrounds looks the same, everything else around it looks different. Of course, another site over here is where Sentinel High School is today. Next picture. This is taken in 1941 up at 6 Mile, just near Houston, and near 9 Mile Ranger Station. It shows the first parachute, which was the Eagle parachute, and it was a training jump at that time they were making. Okay, now I mentioned two companies there. The Johnson Flying Service Company, they contracted for the Forest Service to drop all jumpers, and they actually did that from 1940 to I think it was 1974 or 5 that they were sold to Evergreen Aviation. And the second company was the Eagle Parachute Company out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that contracted the Forest Service for providing the parachutes for the first few years, and also training the parachute, the smoke jumpers. They assigned 4 of their people to do that. They all 4 actually became smoke jumpers themselves. And these 4 men would also pack the parachutes the first few years. Now, 1940, the training was performed up at Seeley Lake for the most part, both at the Seeley Lake Airport and out at Blanchard Flats near Clearwater Junction. The last couple of practice jumps were done in Missoula, up at Sherman Creek and up at Sleeman Gulch near Lowell. And once the training was completed, all the 6 jumpers, that's all Missoula had that year, were loaded onto the Ford Tri-Motor and hauled off into Moose Creek Ranger Station in the what was then the Bitterroot-Selway primitive area. Today it's the wilderness area. And whenever there was a fire, Johnson remained, the airplanes remained at Hale Field, and when there was a fire request, they would fly either to Moose Creek and pick up the jumpers, or they would fly to Winthrop, Washington, where the other base for that year was. And so it wasn't very efficient when they had to fly that far. They weren't getting on those fires really early, you know, like they do nowadays. But anyway, it worked all right. Winthrop ended up with 5 jumpers. They had only 2 fires that year. Missoula in 1940 ended up with 9 fires, and they had 6 jumpers. Another interesting thing about 1940 was the military sent several people out to observe the training. They hadn't started the airborne schools yet. And there was a Major Lee that came out and observed training up at Seeley Lake. And then he went back to Fort Benning, Georgia, and he started up airborne training in, I think it was 1943. And later he became Major General Lee and took 101st Airborne over to Europe and helped prepare for the Normandy invasion. Another interesting fact about that 1940 year was there was a Missoula doctor that was trained for parachute training, for rescue training in the latter part of the year. It was Dr. Lee Martin, and he got the training, but there wasn't any request for his services that year, but next year he did get a call. Now the first fire call came on the 12th of July into Moose Creek, and it was for a fire in Martin Creek, about 10 or 15 miles away from Moose Creek. And Moose Creek, I should point out, is about 50 miles west of Hamilton, and at that time it was on the Bitterroot Forest. Now when this fire call came in, Travel Air came over from Missoula, picked up Earl Cooley and Rufus Johnson and flew them over into Martin Creek and dropped them on the very first fire jump in the U.S. history. The second... Rufus Robinson. Okay, yeah, right. What did Johnson did? You said Johnson. Sorry about that. Thanks, Barry. So then the second request came in was for a rescue jump. one of Johnson's Flying Service Traveler had been dropping cargo on Whitecap Creek, west of Darby in Idaho, and it crash landed. The pilot, Bob Marischitz, died, but the fellow that was pushing the cargo out survived. So Traveler came into Moose Creek again. Chet Derry hopped on board and went out and jumped on that rescue. There was a lookout personnel that from Cub Point that walked down to the crash site, and the two of them gave first aid, and that was the first airborne rescue in smoke jumper history. Now in 1941, they were still doing some of the training up at Seeley Lake, but a lot of it had shifted over to 9 Mile. In fact, that picture right here shows you right near 9 Mile where they made the jump in 1941. And the 9 Mile was used for the Hoem for the Smoke Jumpers from 1940-41 clear up to 1954 when the Smoke Jumper base was built out at the brand new Johnson Field Airport. It's there now. The 9 Mile facilities were the old CCC camps, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that had been abandoned, and still had the barracks and the mess hall and things, so it worked out quite well. And when they got a fire call, they would sometimes the Ford or the Traveler would fly out to 9 Mile, pick up the people and fly to a fire, or else they would have some of those people standing by at Hale Field, and even living in some of the buildings there at the fairgrounds for a while. 1943 presented a problem because this was during the war years, and it was pretty hard to recruit jumpers. Just all the men were off to the service, and the Forest Service even considered shutting down the program. But the conscientious objectors, CPS people, stepped forward and volunteered, and they became the bread and butter of smoke jumping for 1943, 44, and 45. They did a great job. Most of these people were farm kids from back east off of religious organizations like the Mennonites and the Brotherhood and things like that. And they had great work ethics. There was a couple of new bases added to the smoke jumping that year, one in Cave Junction, Oregon, and one in McCall, Idaho. There was another thing that happened in 1943 was the military sent 25 personnel to be trained as pararescue doctors. About half these people were doctors, and they came from the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Army Air Force, and from the Canadian Air Force. And one of them, as soon as the war was over, he moved to Helena. He was a doctor, Dr. Little, and he was called on a number of rescue jumps. And I'll be talking about him when we get to 1945, because he jumped on one there. 1944 was interesting in that it was the first time that the Forest Service fully recognized smoke jumping. It gave full authorization to be one of its important tools in fighting fires. The first 4 years they considered it experimental, and the reason being is that they weren't sure just how safe smoke jumping would be. If there'd be a lot of injuries or deaths, they were ready to cut it off. But there'd been very few injuries. But 1945 changed that around a little bit. It was a hot, dry year, and there was a lot of fires, a lot of fire jumps, and there were, I think there were 9 rescue jumps that year, and performed by the smoke jumpers. Not all for smoke jumpers, but 5 of them I think were smoke jumper injuries. There were a couple of ground personnel that had been fighting fires that they went in and rescued. And then in December there was a jump that was made to downed airplane. It was a World War II B-25. It was flying from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the pilot was Captain Oder, O-E-D-E-R, and he was from Missoula. And so he wanted to overnight in Missoula, and he was making an approach into the Missoula airport in bad weather, and he crashed up on Miller Ridge, just above Miller Creek. Now, they sent out several jumpers to jump in and rescue that aircraft. Dr. Little was one of those people called over to jump on that fire, or on that rescue. In 1945, there was what was called Operation Firefly, and that involved the military, the 555th Infantry Division, also known as a Triple Nickel. Now, this was an all-black airborne unit, and they were sent out to Pendleton, Oregon, and their purpose was to put out any fires that would be caused by the balloons that were being sent over from Japan to the United States. And so when they arrived at Pendleton, the overhead from Missoula base went over and trained them in firefighting techniques and outfitted them in smoke jumper attire. And the mission for these people changed because there was very few fires created by these balloons, and they used them on fighting fires, on mainly larger fires. And also the first fatality occurred then. Marvin Brown, one of the Triple Nickel guys, landed in a tree, and as he was letting down out of the tree, he fell to his death, and that was the first fatality in smoke jumper history. Okay, in 1946, the CPSers was done away with, the program, and the Firefly operation done away with, and it left very few smoke jumpers. And so they hired 160 new men that year. That's the most that's ever been hired for 1 year for Missoula. And most of those, 85% of them were out of the service. There was a lot of guys coming back, as you can imagine, and a lot of the airborne guys came over and applied for the job, and they filled in. In 1947, New Mexico was started up as a base. This was an area where they had an early fire season, and the Missoula jumpers would go down in May and fight fires until about the middle of July, and then come back to Missoula to Region 1 and fight fires here. So it worked out quite well. 48 helicopters were used to return jumpers back to the base, and also for rescue for the first time. 1949, Mann Gulch. 1951, Grangeville and West Yellowstone were made bases in Region 1. They are still operating today. And in 1954, Missoula County Airport was established, and smoke jumpers started working out of the airport there. Okay.
And President Eisenhower came and dedicated.
That's right.
Thanks, Roger.
Height adjustment. I'm Lowell Hanson. I was a smoke jumper from 1958 to 1961, and then I got a little green uniform from 62 to 64, and I jumped from 65 through 1980, so I jumped about 20 fire seasons. My background, I came from a small farm in northern Minnesota, and when I was younger, I belonged to an organization that really stressed first aid and emergency care, because we had farmers that occasionally would kick the silage cutter clear. And of course, they got extra protein for their silage for the cows because they get an ankle or a foot. And the group that I worked with wanted us to be able to handle those kind of things because a lot of us were farm kids. So my first experience with the jumpers, I had worked in the Coeur d'Alene National Forest for 2 years on a blister rust thing, which was probably the lowest job in the Forest Service, but I got a lot of fire service that first year, and then started jumping in 58. In 58, we had quite a bit of first aid training as jumpers, and we were divided into 4 groups, and my group always finished first because I knew all that stuff from 7th and 8th grade and so forth. And along came Mann Gulch, not Mann Gulch, but Hebgen Lake earthquake. And that particular morning, as a second-year jumper, I was just kind of laying back because they normally didn't take inexperienced jumpers on rescue situations. And when my name was called out, I was rather surprised. But anyway, they put 10 of us on the aircraft, and we flew from Missoula to the area where the earthquake had taken place. There was also an air sea land rescue coming out of Salt Lake. And the first group there was to jump, and the second one was to go back to West Yellowstone and work as relay transportation. We had a slower airplane but a shorter distance, so we beat the air sea rescue by 2 minutes. And so they divided us up into 2 different jump groups. I was Al Hammond, who was in charge of it, and we were the first stick to jump. We jumped right up near the dam. And of course, the road had been destroyed there, and then the second stick, or the second group, was Jim Burley and Dick Tracy. Tracy is the squad leader at the time. Burley had been in my training group as a new man. Anyway, and then they took the other 4 and dropped at another place, so the jump for Hebgen Lake was split between 2 areas. And basically, what we were doing was triage, helping get the injured out, but there had been a nurse there that provided most of the emergency care, so all we had to do was help carry them and put them on the helicopters, and then they went into West Yellowstone and from there to the various hospitals. And a couple interesting things, in the second group that dropped, Andy was a foreman, and this young kid came up to him and said, "Can I have this parachute?" And Andy being kind of lackadaisical, said, "Yeah, you can have it." Well, he thought if they were going to make another tent because they were breaking open parachutes to make sun shelters, because it was going to be a while before the people could actually get out of there, the ones that weren't injured. And when Andy came back, they couldn't find the canopy. All they found were the shroud lines and the risers. And the kid and his dad had cut all the lines off the parachute and left the lines and took the canopy. When Andy went back to the base, he threw the risers on our boss's head, and he said, "Light pack out this time." Anyway, we spent the balance of the week walking the river, looking for possible fatalities and so forth. We never did find any. We spent the majority of the week there. It was an interesting jump because first of all, I had limited experience, but I worked with Al Hammond, and he had quite a bit of experience. And when we were actually jumping, we had really a nice grassy jump spot. Well, all the people around there that weren't hurt decided that they could come into the jump spot. And all of a sudden, our nice grassy jump spot changed, and Hammond said, "Take the rocks, kid." And that's where we landed. And then after we got all the people out, I think we evacuated about 14 from that thing. And then 50 years later, I always got a lot of flack from some of my friends. Why do you jump out of a perfectly good airplane? And he was, he was 8 years old at the time, but when I was at this reunion, he said, he said I was really scared, but my dad said, "Don't worry, somebody will come and help." I'll keep it with my. Anyway, just then they heard the parachutes open above him. And of course, that was the second group that helped them to get out. And he said that he was really happy that we were able to come and be a part of that particular organization. Then the second jump I'd like to talk about is one called Ripple Lake. And this is a dynamite accident that happened when they were building trail. And 2 fellows were leaning over a stick of dynamite when it exploded. And they happened to be in a creek bed. And it was like having a shotgun go off in their face. And one was really pretty well hurt. And the other one had a couple of fingers blown off. but we had a difficult time keeping him out of shock than we did the other one. There were 8 of us that jumped, 4 of us with emergency care. Roger Savage was on that particular jump, and he was one that spent the night building a helicopter spot. They had 4 of them working with chainsaws to build a helicopter spot so we could get him out the next morning. Now, the only thing I can relate about my particular jump is that I was supposed to jump in the second group. And the squad leader said, put this demo kit on your leg straps. And I had never had anything on my leg straps before, and I kind of hesitated and said something, and you don't tell the squad leaders very much for very long. So he pulled me out of the line, and I hooked the demo kit on my leg straps, and then I jumped in the next stick. Well, it was dark. I mean, totally dark. You couldn't see anything, and I could see a flashlight. Some guy was watching me against the skyline, and I thought if I can see him, I'll go toward him. Well, then the rascal, what he did, I was about 300 feet off the ground, he turned and walked away. I lost my reference point. So I landed in a tree, actually a snag, and I didn't know how far I was off the ground, but we had 100-foot letdown ropes. And the other thing was I didn't know if I hit the side of the tree or the top of it, because if you hit the side, you can fall out, slide out. And then they had this Demroll kit, and the first impulse was to take it loose from my leg straps and drop it. And those Demroll kits, they were glass vials. Secondly, that wouldn't last very long, and the other thing, it would roll down here, we'd never find it. So I took it off, I made the proper procedure with my letdown rope, and then took my letdown rope out of my pocket and put it inside my jacket, took my leg straps loose, and worked the Demroll kit into my rope pocket. And then the next thing was, should I make a harness letdown, or should I make a cape well letdown? Cape well is where you pop your cape wells, but you drop. You can drop anywhere 6 to 8 inches when that happens. And if you don't know how hard you're hung up, you might go whistling to the ground. So I made the harness letdown, and I used most of my letdown rope. And I had the Demroll kit, and then so I raced over to where they were, because I was supposed to work on the first aid. There were 4 of us assigned to first aid and 4 of us to the helicopter spot. I got there about the same time as the squad leader, Carpenter, and I looked at the man that was hurt the most, and I looked at him and I thought it was the back of his head. It wasn't, it was his face. And I still can smell that burned flesh. And they had us work for 15 minutes at a time and go out for 45. So, and we worked all the way through the night. We didn't have much trouble with him. He was the toughest man I've ever encountered. And when Carpenter came up there, he said, the injured man said, did those jumpers get in okay? And Carp says, is that you? And it was Carpenter's trapping buddy. And he was so badly bruised and beat up that he didn't recognize him. Because when I saw him, I thought it was the back of his head. And it wasn't, it was his face. Well, we worked all night, and we got him out of there the next morning. The helicopters came in and took him out. And the second fellow we had quite a bit of time with, he lost 2 fingers, but he was a lot more shocky than the regular group. As far as, we ended up walking out after that particular one, and it was kind of an interesting experience because it was the first time I'd ever jumped at night. It was rather dark. It was the first time in 39 jumps I'd ever hung up in a tree, and I didn't particularly like it. But fortunately, I didn't have to go and get it. Roger and those folks were so kind as to cut it out and pack it out for us. So, and then the other thing I'd like to say about the rescue jumping with the Forest Service was they're secondary to firefighting. And there have been a lot of rescue jumps throughout the history of the smoke jumping, but mainly we were called to work with Forest Service people, any federal employee, any state employee we could jump with. Civilians we couldn't jump for unless the sheriff requested us and paid for it. And so that's kind of how the rescue thing worked. And then in my last year of jumping was 1979. There was a DC-3 crash down on the Salway. And prior to that, I'd been in the service and I was trained as a Special Forces medic, which was 44 weeks of medic training and shipped all over the Army bases. And it ended up there were 5 of us that went through that particular training. And so we revised quite a bit of the rescue training and trying to teach the jumpers how to handle something if their jump partner got hurt, how to make splints out of the fire boxes and so forth. We had one little exercise which Mr. Hicks was involved with. He broke his leg conveniently on a proficiency jump or a practice jump, and it was pretty realistic. And the foreman in charge of the jump walked over and took one look at it, and Hicks was doing a pretty good job, and he turned around and I noticed he picked up a radio. And then I realized that he was calling in a helicopter. So I had to run quick and tell him this was a practice thing. Well, he explained to me in no uncertain terms, no more exercises about out-informing the jump foreman of what's going on. And Mr. Hicks will probably remember the things that were told me about that particular situation. Well, the last rescue jump I made, I was the chief foreman. And prior to that, I had been a squad leader, a foreman, and I'd managed the smoke jumper base at Boise. And I came back to Missoula. My last job, I was the chief foreman in training for fire and aviation. So we did quite a bit of training. We revised quite a bit of the medical stuff. I don't know, it's been 36 years since I've been out there, so I don't know how the rescue things were working today. But we got it was my first day as the chief foreman. I was walking across the ramp to give my old boss's lecture, and I won't use the exact terms he used, but he used to talk about bite your lower lip and be the rough tough you hired out to be. I didn't get to give that lecture because Charlie Rogers called and said, come up to dispatch. And the way he said it kind of irritated me, and I went flying up the steps 3 at a time and opened up the door, and he said, plane down. Get your rescue boys going. So at that time I handpicked from the overhead there, and we took 12 people. And this happened, DC-3 had crashed about 10:30 in the morning, and we got this fire call about 12:30. So these people have been in the water and so forth for quite a period of time. We got over the area, and the project superintendent decided he wanted to go. Well, I had this big emergency medical bag, and it's kind of hard to jump second with that thing. So I explained he could either jump with it first, or I would jump first, and he could jump second. He reluctantly gave up his spot. And so I made the jump, and then I noticed when I went back through the jump spot that he must have hit really hard because there was grass all over his shoulder, and there's a big divot where apparently he landed. But he was a tough guy. He could handle it. And I got down there and went down along the river, and the first thing I found was a dog injured. And then I got to actually where the two people were hurt. One was an older man in the rock in the middle of the river, and the other one was a young kid sitting on the bank, and it looked like he either had a fractured humerus or a dislocated shoulder. And he was pretty shocky, so I took my jump jacket, put it on him, and then we went to work on the man in the rock. And I put on mask pants that's like pantyhose, but you pump them up to get the blood pressure to go back into the main part of the body. And I took his blood pressure and it was 40 over nothing. And I figured he was going to last about 2 hours, so I was wrong. He lasted about 30 minutes. So I started CPR, and one of the medics guys with me said, "You broke all his ribs." And when I made my first compression, I did. I broke all the ribs on his left side. And we continued for about 30 minutes, realizing he wasn't going to. So when we stayed there overnight, and they evacuated out the young man that had the injured shoulder, and then we stayed overnight, and the deceased person went out with us. When I turned him over, I should have known from all my training that he had a lung removed. And I never had an impression that a burly guy like that working for the Forest Service wouldn't have 2 lungs, and that's how come I broke all his ribs. But the other thing about that thing is, first time I'd ever worn a Forest Service uniform, step over log and rip my pants from one knee to the other. And the young guy that was sitting there with the injured shoulder told the regional forester, I'd like to find the kid, he said, when I saw the old gray-haired smoke jumper, I knew I was going to live.
Thank you, Barry. I'm Ted Nyquist. I started working Forest Service in 1952 and got on with the jumpers in 1954. I would like to relate to you an adventure that we had when stationed down at the Grangeville jump base. This took place September 9th, 1963 at the Smokejumper base, and a fellow by the name of Tom Uphill was the foreman, and he readied the 8-man jumper request and map case for the Trilby Lakes fire. The Smokejumper base, referred to as the Loft, consisted of sleeping barracks for 16 jumpers, a small dispatch office, parachute loft, and gear storage, all in a small white frame building at the airport in Grangeville. Ford Trimotor NC 7861 was parked within yards of the front door. We were right on the airport. Trilby Lakes is located high in the Sabi Creek drainage of the Nez Perce National Forest, and the creek flows about 10 miles south into the Salmon River. The first 8 jumpers, Dave Bennett, Tom Schrader, Dave Lancaster, Barry Robinson, Richard McElroy, Dave Hess, and Bill Locklear, were assigned from the rotating jump list and immediately began to suit up. I was to be the spotter. I was a squad leader at the time, and so I studied the large mosaic wall map in the office, then began to assist the jumpers in attaching their main and emergency parachute packs. Pilot Frank Borgeson started up the number 1 and 2 engines of the Ford Trimotor, and after we entered, he fired up the number 3 right engine next to the fuselage doorway. Shortly, we began rolling down the taxiway. He pushed full throttle, and the tail bobbed slightly when we surged forward, and the engines created a great roaring, vibrating, unsynchronous beat of noise. I checked my watch and recorded takeoff time at 1415 hours, 2:15 p.m. In my pocket diary, aware of our efforts to reduce elapsed time between fire request and takeoff. The tail came up, leveling the fuselage. Then we lifted off with a cooler breeze, quickly improving comfort levels, and the helmets came off. The Ford Trimotor was a slow, lumbering, huge-winged, corrugated metal beast dubbed the Tin Goose. Normal cruise speed was close to 100 miles per hour. The sound in flight was utterly distinctive and immediately recognized by any jumper within earshot. As we approached Elk City, which was an old mining town, and our checkpoint, we would make a slight turn to the south, and this would put us in line with Trilby Lakes. Some of the jumpers were dozing, while others watched the terrain. Then, a sudden, startling explosion shook the aircraft, followed by a choking cloud of hay dust dislodged from all the nooks and cracks of the fuselage. The dust had been deposited by transporting baled hay into Moose Creek Wilderness Station. The cloud cleared itself fairly quickly, and I noticed my left hand was bleeding from shrapnel that came up from the floor. A thought flashed through my mind that maybe somebody was shooting at us. Our attention was captured immediately by a violent, noisy shaking of the entire aircraft, as if inside of a jackhammer. It seemed to come from number 3 right side engine, and as I glanced out the window searching for some understanding of what was happening, I noticed the forward engine cowling come loose, thrusting itself into the propeller with a shower of sparks. This repeated itself several times as the whole engine gradually arced downward, but still remained attached to the wing. My alarm increased as I saw the exposed fuel line break, spraying fuel over the rear of the engine and into the slipstream. Frank's full attention was focused on recovering control and trim of the aircraft. I shouted over the noise and motioned toward the severed fuel line. He reached behind me to a small valve where I turned for a quick look at the jumpers. They had abandoned all protocols of command and control, and I saw the last 3 jumpers exiting the doorway. A helmet rolled into their traffic and was kicked aside, but went out the door with the last jumper. Dave Bennett had witnessed several metal parts fly by the window and the door. Scott heard someone shout, "We're going down, get out, get out." Schrader and Bennett assisted each other hooking up static lines, then began their exits. Several of the jumpers found their gloves on top of their emergency parachute packs as they descended. The spray of gas subsided and the engine folded further down, then completely wrenched itself free and fell away with a huge whoop. I noticed the newly exposed sublayer of our right front tire. The propeller must have chopped the rubber off the tire, and that was the final assault that broke the engine free. I went back to the overhead rack and took down my spotter's emergency parachute and buckled the snaps, then glanced back toward the cabin. Frank was looking directly at me, face ashen white, eyes large, as he gave a commanding, imploring shout, "Move the gear back." My decision was automatic, instinctual, and took perhaps a few seconds. The spotter pack came off and I pulled a twisted mass of static lines back inside the plane, moved the gear toward the front, and then jumped back into the co-pilot's right seat. The noise and vibration had ceased, and Frank was frantically preparing for a landing at a small airstrip surrounded by a busy sawmill and log yard. I had no idea it was there, but he knew. I seized the AirNet microphone, which was reserved for all aircraft operations throughout Region 1, and with as deliberate a composure as I could, said, "Grangeville Jump Base, this is Ford 6-1. Foreman Uphill answered, "This is Grangeville Jump Base, hold 1. I did not know that the weather forecast was being broadcast from the Nez Perce National Forest Supervisor's office at the same time. I repeated the call with no answer. I turned to the forest net, a frequency used by all workstations and vehicles on the forest. Then I let it all hang out. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, this is Ford 6-1. We've lost an engine. All the jumpers have bailed out. We'll try to land near Elk City." Frank was gauging his altitude and completing the first portion of a 270-degree turn for our one chance approach and landing at the log yard strip. After completing 180 degrees, I was amazed to see a Forest Service vehicle stopped and with the door open and the driver running for this little strip with the car fire extinguisher in hand. He had acted immediately after hearing us overhead and the Mayday transmissions on his car radio. We came in low on the 2 remaining engines directly over the driver's head and barely cleared a barbed wire fence. We touched down to an immediate, violent bursting of the right front tire. Coasted very shortly, then ground looped on top of the distorted, blown out remnants of the right tire. A momentary silence ensued. Then Frank and I grabbed and shook each other in joy. Just long enough to realize that danger and uncertainty were still hanging heavy in the tilting trimotor. We ran out the door and stood staring from a short distance, still grasping for some reason and understanding. Our restraint was short-lived as we cautiously approached and began intently inspecting first the gaping hole, vacant hole where the missing engine had once been positioned. Then a sharp, elongated 9-inch cut entering near the bottom of the fuselage just behind the cockpit seats. That's where I came up with the bloody hand when the shrapnel came up. I had it hanging over the edge. On the opposite side of the fuselage, but higher up on the wall, another hole of the same dimensions showed evidence an object had exited it, subsequently hit the woven wire cables that control the tail, forming sharp V-shaped creases in the cable. Frank then came to the realization that a piece of the propeller had broken off and flew through the airplane with explosive force. Further inspection revealed the piece had continued its rising angle to cut completely through the left wing, leaving a small indentation 1 inch long, 1/2 inch deep in the fuel wing tank, but not big enough to create a hole. Bill Locklear was the last jumper to exit the trimotor and could see where we had landed, so steered his parachute very close to the landing site. Soon a mill yard employee and operator of a log transporting machine arrived to tell us of his observation of seeing the airplane's engine fall into a mud bank of the creek and creating an impressive crater right next to his machine. The Nez Perce Force supervisor, John Mila Dragovich, arrived en route to Grangeville, having seen the Ford and wondered why it was landing on the American River Sawmill airstrip next to these huge log decks. He found, subsequently, pieces of the engine along the road, and that kind of answered his question. Gradually, the Smokejumpers arrived at the airstrip with their gear, and they inspected the airplane. Then Locklear stated that he had been sitting on the chainsaw box, but moments before the explosion had moved to the front of the box and leaned against it just inches from the prop fragment's path. This very fortuitous move likely spared his life. A powerful elation and relief settled over us as we began to comprehend our good fortune. I place all due credit with Frank Borgeson with the skillful piloting of the trimotor under extreme duress. We ate dinner in Elk City and had a warm summer night's ride back to Grangeville in an open-air steak truck, with time to ponder the hard-to-imagine twists of fate and fortune. Tom Schrader pulled out a rum-soaked crook cigar and with some pomp and circumstance said, "I smoke one of these when things are going my way." Here's the forest supervisor, myself, and the pilot, Frank Morgeson, standing. Here's the blown out tire, the missing engine, and you can't quite see where the prop had entered into the fuselage. Here are the jumpers after they brought their gear back. There's one missing. I think it's McElroy and the rest of us. Here you see where the cables are, which ran on the outside of the aircraft. and went up through that hole in the wing, up through the top, and that's where it clipped the wing tank. And that's where it came out on the top. Here is Barry Robinson. He went all the way back there. He wanted to retrieve that propeller, and he came back to Grangeville Airport with it. And I have subsequently heard that some hunter found that fragment, and I tried to follow it up, but I never did have any success. I call this incident over Elk City. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Bud Clarke, and that's not my real name. My real name is Conald, C-O-N-A-L-D. And my folks told me that was a good Irish name. And but unfortunately, they didn't name my brothers a good Irish name. Their names were Ronald and Donald. So the Clarke boys were Ronald, Conald, and Donald. So that's hard to live with, you know. I grew up in Kettle Falls, Washington, which is about 70 miles north of Spokane. And it's a farming, mining, logging community. The Columbia River passes right through there. There's some recreation stuff there. When I was 14, I moved to a ranch up on what they call Kelly Hill, and worked for a family up there for a couple of years, all summer long, and one year even stayed up there to do chores and stuff like that at night. I left there, and friends of mine's dad owned a sawmill or two around there. So I tried my luck at working in a sawmill. And a lot of you know about what's being done in a sawmill, and I actually had a pretty good start. I worked for a week or two on the green chain, and then they promoted me, and I drove a straddle bug and drove it around and picked up piles of lumber and things like that. But I could see I didn't have a future there. And then I went to the quarries, and I really liked the quarries. Rock quarries. We made building stone for building, big buildings, houses, front, all different colored building stones. There, they had big equipment. They had explosives. They had a 16-pound maul that I broke big rocks into little rocks. But it was a good occupation for me. I really enjoyed that. And but in 82, I decided to, 62, I decided to come to Montana. And so I took off driving to Montana and was driving down the road at where the $50,000 silver bar is there. There's a nursery there called the Savanac Nursery. And I thought, what a neat place that was. So I pulled in there and got a job. I asked them if they needed help, and they said, yeah, when can you start? And I said, well, what about right now? They said, oh, no, wait till tomorrow. We'll put you on tomorrow. So that introduced me to fire. And the next year, I worked in at 9 Mile and worked on the hotshot crew. And in '64, I started jumping. And there was 2 or 3 slow years, but then in late '60s, MTDC, Missoula Equipment Development Center, they were talking about looking at fireline explosives for building fireline, and so they started this program, and they invited me to join them. You ought to give it.
Was that your signature?
Now. We did a lot of testing beforehand, and there was a lot of mishaps to begin with, and we started several fires, and because of the explosives, just a flash from it would start fires, so we started putting salts around it, and the salt would keep the flash from the explosives from starting fires. So from '69, for the next 2 or 3 years, we kept development. We came up with this. You could change it over again.
What is that?
That is FLE, Fireline Explosives. And this was some of the original stuff. This isn't the product. Now that I can see it here, but I couldn't tell before. But this was some of the experimental stuff that we had. What we use now and what we used later on was one continuous line. Didn't have those spacers in there. Anyway, the way we set this off, well, first of all, I'll tell you about the explosives. It comes in 7-strand or 4-strand, and the inside of it is 7 strands of det cord, which is PETN, and that's pentaurethral tetranitrate, and that is the same as a det cord that you got. And so the 7-strand had 1,400 grains. The results of it was really good. The efficiency of it was really good. It was something that didn't cost as much, and took less people to string it out, so you could blow a fire line. And so it took off pretty good. One of the things, well, the thing that we used to set it off with was EBW, which stand for exploding Bridgewire. And this cap that we used was top secret during World War II. The military had developed it, and so by the time '69 rolled around, it was going into the public sector. And what this EBW cap, it's got a solid gold bridge wire, and then it's got PETN, which is a secondary explosive. A regular cap's got primary explosives in it, and you can take a pair of pliers and hit that with a hammer or something, it'll explode. With the EBW, it wouldn't. The system had a battery pack, and it had a capacitor, and this battery pack would leak electricity down to this capacitor. It would build up, and then release precise amount of electricity in a precise time. And when that hit that cap, it would explode that gold wire. And So then it would detonate the cord. It made it a lot easier for shipment handling because the caps were the same as the explosives. So we didn't have to put in different boxes, different airplanes or anything like that. In 1974, a friend of mine, well, another jumper and I, he was my assistant, jumped the very first fire ever made with Firefly explosives. And we jumped into Outlaw Ridge, which was over on the St. Joe. And that was quite an experience because we had a little thing that happened. We jumped, and Larry and I were on top of this ridge, and it was a pretty steep ridge. So Floyd Whitaker, he was dropping the cargo to us. He come around the Twin Beach, and 2 boxes, which weighed 100 pounds, he dropped them out. Everything was fine. Then second pass came around. He threw the cargo out, and we're standing there, and it was obvious as soon as he threw it out that that parachute wasn't going to open. And here come 100 pounds of explosives coming down, going to hit the hillside. And, you know, I already trusted this stuff, but my immediate reaction was I just turned and I dove over the side of the ridge there. So I was on the opposite side of where the explosives hit. And when I dove down there, I looked back, and Larry Eisman was standing on top of the ridge with his hands in his ears. Thought, boy, that's going to save you. And so anyway, obviously nothing happened. It just didn't even hardly hurt the explosives. We strung it out, did our job, and so anyway, you can say. There's. By the way, I went up in 1975, and I trained the Alaska jumpers and the people up there, and they used it a lot. They don't use it now, and I'll tell you a little later why they don't use it, but here's one of the blasts. Okay. We love building fire line at 13,000 feet a second. There, okay, now. Besides building fire line, there's other uses for it, probably just as important as building fire line. First of all, there's hazard trees, there's snags on fires, there's potholes that I blew in Michigan to create water so that they could fight the fire, because the water was about 6 inches under the ground and everything was dry above it, and they were burning out. So I made these potholes. Cows, yeah, blew up cows. They're they're hard to catch when they don't want to be. But and the hazard trees, this is kind of what they're doing here. And there was 2 different ideas on how to do this, and I never did it this way because it's an open air blast, and if you're blowing snags and stuff like that, it might cause other snags to go down. This will throw things a long distance. I always had with me a hand drill at 1.5 inch bit, and I'd go up to the tree and drill 2 holes in the front and 1 in back. Ain't gonna happen. And then blow them. So anyway, well, I got to decide which story I'm going to tell now. And so we'd blow them over, and well, anyway, had the experience of going down the middle fork of the Salmon River, a river of no return. Went up to Indian Creek, and Larry Eisman and I again. He gets me these projects that I like. And so a tourist had been camping out, and they got designated campgrounds where they had to go. And he was camped out. Big windstorm came up, blew a snag down, and he was sleeping in a sleeping bag, and it came down right beside him, but a branch hit him across the face and the nose, and they couldn't get the bleeding stopped. So they evacuated him out of there as quick as they could. So they called us, and in the river of no return, you can't use chainsaws or machinery or anything like that to get anything done. So the FLE was the best thing that they could do after that. So I get in a raft, and there's 3 or 4 rafts. I load it with explosives, come down to the campgrounds, and take these snags that are around there close, and load them up, blow them over, and they look just like the wind-blown one that had fell on this guy. It just left no evidence of humans even being it. It looked like it's blowed out. So we spent 4 days floating the middle fork of the Salmon, and got that job done. Hopefully nobody else got hurt after that from falling snags. I want to tell the story. 1 minute. Alaska, it really worked good in tundra. It was great. And they used it for many years. And one day they went out and blew a line, and they accidentally went over what they called an ice dome. And this ice dome, and when I was jumping up there, I jumped a lot in Alaska. When I was up there, I didn't know these things exist, but they found it. They accidentally put the line over that. And what it is, you got tundra, and you got the permafrost, and then underneath that was just a big open room. And sometimes could be 150 feet. They found one that was 150 feet from the bottom to where the tundra was, and people were walking across the top of this. And they blew a hole in that, and what happened was then, when all the water started running, it tried to fill up this void under there, and it started washing, and it made such an environmental impact. And since you don't know where these are, they made them quit using it up there. And but they did hold the record of the longest blast. They used helicopters and things like that. One blast, 7 miles long. So, thank you.
I will gimp up to the lectern with my new knee. Best part's yet to come, folks. Hi, my name is Bob Whaley. I was born and raised here in Missoula. Graduated from Missoula County High School and Carroll College, and after my last year of jumping in 1958, joined the Marine Corps, and then went into
aviation from Quantico, Virginia to Pensacola, Florida, and I had a 21-year career in marine aviation. Retiring in 1979, I came home in 1980 and got into the investment business with financial consultants for 24 years, and retired in 2004. And I've been, my part, as you can see, is the Trails program, and I've been involved with it since 1999, when I was with Art Jukla, who unfortunately died on our project that we had that year. And you can go to the next one there if you would, Sandy, thanks. You can see from this chart that we have here how the program has grown through the years from 1999 up to the present. This is really the signature program of the National Smokejumper Association. It really is something that has a lot of moving parts, and we've broken it down into divisions of responsibility that include logistics, planning, operations, and finance. We've got regional satellite project leaders around the country. And Gary, would you mind bringing that map up here to kind of show the folks how we've grown and where we've grown to throughout the country? We're in national forests and national parks all over the country, and it just wants to continue to grow. So that'll give you an idea of where we are now with our program. Thank you. I think that'll probably, yeah. He's, what a guy. Let's give Gary a hand. When you get into logistics, the next one, please, Sandy. This looks awfully boring, but it shows you the moving parts that we have. Tools and equipment are extremely valuable to us, and we are fortunate to have a Connex box out at the Jump Center and store our gear there. We also have storage, and some of the guys here in town have some saws that they take care of. DeCullough sharpens their saws for us, and he does a great job. And it's really important that we have that material for us in order to go on our various projects that we have around the country. You can see that from the map that Gary showed you there, there's no way we can ship our tools throughout the country, so we're trying to get enough funds together to let these regional or satellite project leaders do the work themselves and have the tools and equipment available to them to do that work. That poses a bit of a problem to us, but we think we can solve it. Then we get into the planning part of it, the agency, foundation, liaison, and so forth. A lot of work goes in there with the squad leaders. They have to make sure that they're working with the regional offices, the forests, the ranger districts, and so forth. And we have a real good rapport with a lot of the districts from year to year, so it's really good that we continue that because they identify the projects they want to have done. They have a priority list, and we identify the people that we think can do the work and get on with it. The registration forms that we have are quite interesting. It'll show the projects that we have identified that we want to have done for that year. We start identifying those probably in late, maybe December, November, December, and into January. And we like to have those projects identified at least by February so we can get them out to the on the internet and let the members of the organization look at what they want to do and identify our squad leaders. And they sign up for it, and we get the whole program going. We have a little problem right now with getting qualified squad leaders. It takes a lot of time and effort to be a squad leader, and you really have to stay on top of it and make sure that all the coordination is going the way it should be going with the ranger district, with your volunteers, with the food, with your packers if you happen to be fortunate enough to be in the wilderness and use packers. So that work is very important as well. Annual reporting at the end of the year is a real pain in the butt. But it has to be done because we have to justify what we did, show the work that we did, particularly with foundations because they fund us and they have to report to their board of directors exactly what we did, how many trees we took off the trail, how many water bars we put in, detailed stuff like that. We get it done, and I think that, as far as I'm concerned, I don't mind it because I don't mind writing, but we have a hard time getting those things in time, into the individual that puts it together. I brought a copy of it here just to show you how much work goes into the thing. This is the end of year report, and I don't know how many pages. I haven't counted them all, probably about 60. But the individual that does that is Steve Carlton over in Washington, and Steve does a fantastic job. I think he should be Volunteer of the Year sometime, because he really does a lot of work, and he's on everybody's butt throughout the year to get the reports in. He gets all the photographs, puts it all together, checks spelling, does the whole 9 yards, and nobody says thanks hardly. And that's just not right. He does a fantastic job. Getting down into the training, we've got to make sure that all of our volunteers are trained in first aid, AED, and CPR. And fortunately, those of us that are here in Missoula can go out and piggyback on the training that the Smokejumpers do out here. So we're very fortunate in that regard. We don't have the same luxury with those that come from around the country. And we have a lot of them come from North Carolina, Texas, Colorado, North Dakota. They come in from all over. And they'll have to get that training someplace else. A lot of times for the first aid, they can go to a fire station or they can go to the Red Cross. You can even do it online. So we want to make sure that they're trained. And you have to do that once every 3 years, isn't it? Or 2 years? Every 3, yeah, okay. And also for getting the training on crosscuts and chainsaws. We have to have that training as well. That sometimes is difficult to get done. Safety is very important. When we go out in our projects, and we're in the wilderness, we try to have a safety meeting in the morning, depending upon what we're going to be doing that day. If it's felling trees, then you have to make sure that you've got your hard hats for the guys that are doing that. If you're doing brush hooks with brushing and that sort of thing, making sure that you're not too close to each other, because I'll tell you, you can get hurt real quickly if you're not paying attention. So we make sure we do the little briefings that we have. Finance. You can probably go another, get some pictures here, just to show some of the pictures that have come in from some of the projects that I've been on. We're really lucky in the crews that I've had. We've been in the North Idaho, and North Idaho Backcountry Horsemen have been wonderful in supporting us. Those guys just do backflips for us, and we really appreciate it. As well as a lot of the backcountry horsemen from around here. They do a lot of stuff for the projects around here too, so our accolades go out to that group of people. That's Jim Renshaw. He is a legend in his own time. Jim lives down in Kuski, Idaho, and has been supporting us for the last 10 years. Last 2 years, he's not, I shouldn't say last 10, last 2 years he's not been able to do it because he says, them packs is just getting too heavy. And he has a hard time, and he's very proud, and he doesn't want any help. So he's kind of backed off a little bit, and he's also had a few health problems. But he is a character and somebody that we're very proud to having had the ability and privilege of working with through the years. And that's just some of the stock that we have been fortunate enough to haul all our stuff in with. Finance. That's a boring topic, but I'll tell you, we're really getting pushed to the limit right now with the ability to have the forests provide us funding for all the projects that we have. There was a memo that came out not too long ago, and Fred Cooper was kind enough to send it to me this morning, and it talks about funding for the forests, and the areas that are going to get the majority of the funding don't happen to be in Region 1 because we don't have a population here to support it. So the money that we're going to be getting, the Forest Service is going to be getting to support the Trails project is going to be going to the coast. And that is too bad, because we've got more trails to do, to take care of, and they can deteriorate a lot faster up in our country than they do on the coast because they're getting used a lot on the coast, therefore they're getting attention. One of the things that Fred and a number of us went to the Wilderness and Recreation Conference this past January when we were briefed on the Washington office decision. And it said those regions and forests with most use of their trails will get the most money. George Bain, the director for recreation here in Region 1, gave a briefing and said he fought the best battle he could to argue against the 30% trails reduction in Region 1, but he lost. So that creates a bit of a problem for continuing to get the support that we need for $25 a day per person, and which gives us enough to buy our food. I'll give you the example. We are fortunate to have, in my crew, be supported by the Selway Bitter Frank Church Foundation. They give us $1,500. And of that, I go out and do the shopping and probably spend anywhere from $1,000 to $1,100. That leaves us a little bit of a balance in there that we can give some money to the backcountry horsemen for their mileage, which we like to do. And if whatever's left over, if we have $300 or $400 left over, whatever it comes out to, we like to put that into our kitty to build up the assets that we have so we can maintain our tool cache and buy tools and so forth. Well, we've been fortunate to have the ability to build that fund up so that we don't think that we need all of that money for the purposes that I mentioned, and we're able to give some of that money to the Art Jukla Scholarship Fund for educating kids of the jumpers who have died in the line of duty. And we have spent some of that money for that purpose. Also the Good Samaritan Fund for jumpers' families who fall on hard times for one reason or another. We've been able to support that. I think those days are numbered for us. If we're not going to be able to get the support that we need from the Forest Service in the amount that we need in order to sustain the operation, then I don't know that we can continue. Good. That would be a shame, because these individuals who come from all over the country to volunteer for the Trails program spend a lot of their own money to come here, and it is not something I want to see them have to pay for to come and work for free for the government. They're going to have to prioritize what they want done and come up with the funds, because otherwise, you saw that first chart that I had up here, stair-stepping up from 2 crews or 2 projects or 4 projects to 25 again this year. You're going to see that start to come down, and that would be a real shame for our forests. That pretty much covers what I wanted to share with you as far as the Trails program is concerned. Oh, yeah, that is not me. That's Dennis Pearson. And when Dennis used to go out there and jump in the lake, we said, "Where's Dennis?" "Dennis is out there crawling." And yeah, it's not all work. We do get into some good areas where we do some good, we have fishing and we enjoy ourselves. And there's one last one, we have one more there, up in the Selway. And by gosh, we don't know where that guy came from. That's Gary Wireman and Dennis Pearson. Chuck Fricky, I think, is in there. Anyway, photoshopping is really nice. Somebody said once, when you talk about jumping or flying airplanes or whatever, I think Neville Shute said this. It's his quote. He says, "To put your life in danger from time to time breeds a saneness in dealing with day-to-day trivialities." And there's a lot to be said about that. The other thing was, somebody said, "How long do you want to live?" The answer was, long enough to still have someone to play with, but not so long if I don't. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Harold Hoem. Born and raised in Butte, Montana, from a Cornish miner family. Thanks, Joe. On one side, I call that the pasty side, and the Norwegians, I call that the lutefisk side. I worked underground in the copper mines right out of high school, then on a lookout tower before smoke jumping in Missoula in 58, 59, 57, 58, and 59. On fires in Montana, Idaho, and in the North Cascades of Washington. I was inspired to get into smoke jumping by Red Skies of Montana movie. After graduating in literature and history from the University of Washington, I brought my wife Janice back to Butte the following summer to get acquainted with that fabulous town and my family. While there, I was a fire guard and supervised fire crews made up of Butte bar stool occupiers just sitting there with no thought in mind except the next fire call. They were terrific, by the way. Next, I was a special agent with the Office of Naval Intelligence in the 60s, mostly in Japan and in Vietnam, 67 and 68. Cold Wars and Hot Wars. In the 1970s through the 90s, I owned and operated a deep-sea fishing boat out of Ballard, fishing the Pacific and Alaska and Bering Sea waters, with my wife Jan occasionally crewing, and my daughter Marcia crewed for 14 years. I didn't need any special training, just lutefisk jeans. We lived far from the boat in the Methow Valley and North Cascade Mountains. I retired there first and then moved back to Montana. I kept up an interest in wildfires and visited several large fire sites in Montana, Canada, and California, and worked to promote the Firewise programs. Ironically, both houses we built and lived in the North Cascades, but no longer owned, fortunately, burned up in the 300-plus square mile Carlton complex fire of 2014, right to the ground. And if you haven't seen that, you really kind of have to see something like that to believe it. The flames were observed to be moving like waves on the ocean. In 2015, another mega fire in that general area burned an additional 400 square miles and took 3 firefighters' lives. That same year, I visited the Mann Gulch area with friend Chuck Sundstrom. Here's my quick summary of the Mann Gulch fire. On the 5th of August, 1949, a wildfire overran 16 firefighters in Mann Gulch on the Helena National Forest in Montana. Only 3 survived, the foreman and 2 members of a 15-member smoke jumper crew that had parachuted in on the hottest day on record. The fire was located in steep, jagged terrain just above the cliffs of the gates of the mountains on the Missouri River. The fuel growth was a mix of Doug fir, ponderosa pine, and waist-high, dry, cured grass. The locale is said to be one of the roughest areas east of the Continental Divide. They jumped at about 4 p.m., about 3/4 of a mile east of a lightning spark blaze that covered an estimated 60 acres on the ridge separating Mann Gulch and Meriwether Canyon. At the time, they thought it a routine fire to fight. But the static line on the chute dropping their radio broke, and the radio augured in. They were incommunicado, and that proved to be important. Their leader, Wag Dodge, soon located Harrison, an ex-jumper who was a fire guard and had been fighting the fire alone on Meriwether Ridge. Dodge grew very apprehensive about fighting the fire on the ridge. Together with Harrison and the jumper crew, they sought to retreat down the gulch toward the river. They contoured down Mann Gulch, but stayed above the gulch bottom so they could observe the fire. But because of the terrain and the smoke, Dodge could not see that the fire had spotted by firebrands across the gulch towards the bottom in heavy fuels. He didn't know that they were on a collision course when a deadly fire blew up that would soon engulf most of the Gulch, including their jump spot in the cargo area. When they saw the dangerous fire below coming at them and turned around at about 5:45, they were in a foot race that couldn't be won. What was good for the fire, the heat, the wind, the fuel, and the steepness, was very bad for them. Dodge had been banged up in his parachute landing and knew he couldn't outrun the fire. As they came out of the timber, some inspiration born of desperation led him to get out his matches and start an escape fire in the grass to create an area of black that they could get into. He tried to convince the others to lay down in it with him, but this was all new to them. Instead, they ran for their lives up the Gulch, but the fire outran them. All except Dodge and 2 others died. The rookies Sally and Rumsey had run straight up the rim rocks to the rim rocks on the up Gulch side of the escape fire and made it through a gap in the rim rock and soon found refuge in a rock pile. This action, from when the jumpers turned around until when they were caught, took only about 15 minutes. 13 crosses mark where they fell. Pause to think about that. If you could show the slide. Back up. This is the memorial. Okay, I don't know if I can work this thing. We got the right hand. Okay. That was the memorial that they had to the firefighters at the Meriwether campground. It lists all the names of those who died there. Next slide. This is looking across from Meriwether Ridge across to the rim rocks you see there. The jump spot was somewhere up here, and they started coming down here, and then they, after Dodge decided they shouldn't be there, they should get somewhere else, they came roughly down this where I can't tell exactly, and then back up. And somewhere in here, you can't see it on the size of this picture, are the 13 crosses. Next slide, I guess. This is a sign that's placed on Meriwether Ridge. I think Roger was instrumental in getting that there. And it describes how the blow-up happened and what happened to the firefighters. Red skies of Montana. This is a view down the from the ridge down to the Missouri River. And I think that's the red skies of Montana came out just a few years after the event, but is only loosely based on Mann Gulch and is fitted with a Hollywood storyline. Young Men on Fire, a book by Norman McLean, was published 2 years after McLean's death in 1990. A Great Day to Fight Fire by Missoulian Mark Matthews came out in 2007 and has more details of the lives of the crew and several notes at the end of the book that are very informative. Mann Gulch Fire, A Race That Couldn't Be Won, is a scientific study by Rothermel, a look at the fire and the attempted escape. There was much contention and lawsuits by families of some of the deceased, but a board of review upheld Dodge's actions and mentioned the effectiveness of the escape fire. Others thought it was a whitewash. At the end of the day, the Forest Service acknowledged the need for better knowledge of fire behavior, safety considerations, and training. If there was anything positive to be gained by the tragedy, this would be it for the future of firefighters everywhere. Next slide. This is a view from Chuck's boat looking upstream. Meriwether Campground is right in here somewhere. And right, this is the gates of the mountains itself, the real gates. And Mann Gulch is just to the left of that, going up that way. It's, you talk about rough country. Boy, that fire ended up being about 5,000 acres, something like that. Took 450 men eventually. Other people have said the fire kind of burned itself out in all this rough terrain. Thank you. I was going to show, and I don't know if we have time, a film of modern firefighter conditions and where firefighters are confronting climate change with these great big fires like the ones in the Meadow. This film is based more in Colorado. Thank you.
I just want to say that if you, Ariel, come on up. Ariel is one of the current Missoula Smokejumpers, and I just thought Boyd Burtch was pulling my leg when he said he had a smokejumper by the name of Ariel Starr. that he wanted to help us do this, but that's really your name, right?
Yes, my name is Ariel Starr, and yes, that is my real name, and no, my parents weren't Hicks. I rookied in 2012.
Get on the mic so we can hear.
Okay. I don't know if can you guys hear me now? Is that good? Okay. I rookied in 2012 out of Redding, California, and due to a really, really bad case of poison oak, they gave me the boot, and I ended up here in Missoula. But I am really fortunate and privileged to be here in Missoula because my family lives in the Bitterroot Valley. They migrated from Alaska, where we're originally from. So, and I just want to give a shout out, thanks for all you guys here and all the audience here. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here to give a presentation, so thank you very much. So what I'm going to talk about today is the female history and jumping. So changing the status quo is the presentation title, and the biggest thanks that we have to give to that is Deanne Schulman, but I'll get into that in a little bit. This picture right here is a current Missoula smoke jumper. Her name is Erin Kate Springer. She is, this is her just finishing a 100-mile race on foot. So if that gives you an idea of kind of the tenacity and the level of fitness that we kind of just fall into and what we like to do as female smoke jumpers, this is it. So this is her in her spare time. She's a great lady, and I asked her to write an autobiography about her experience in jumping, because this slideshow is actually one that I give to 8th grade girls in Corvallis every year for females in male-dominated jobs. And I asked Erin to write a biography, and this is a piece I got from it. Next slide. She says, I must say one last thing. The reason gender is not an issue is because of the woman who forged a place for us in wildland fire back in the 1970s and 1980s. They were the pioneers that broke down gender barriers with tenacity and fortitude. Our generation and yours owes it to them to never give up or use being a girl as an excuse for not trying to reach your goals and dreams. So the thanks that we have for that is Deanne Schulman. Next slide. This is Deanne Schulman. She rookied originally in 1979. She was strong enough, she was fit enough, and she was smart enough to get through all the rigorous tests of a jumper back in these guys' time. And unfortunately, though, she couldn't jump that year because of you guys probably remember, the height and weight requirement was a lot different back than it is now. So we'll move to the next slide. So back in these guys' salty days, you had to be anywhere between 5'5" and 6'3", and you had to weigh between 130 and 190 pounds. Deanne Schulman didn't cut that. That's why she didn't get to jump. But she filed a complaint with Equal Employment Opportunity, and it wasn't EEO that changed the rules. I think it came later. It wasn't her filing a complaint with EEO that got her into jumping. It actually happened a couple years later, but she was a single case. And so in 1981, she became the very first female to rookie out of McCall, Idaho, and also the very first female in the United States to rookie as a female. And so 1981, Deanne Schulman paved the way for the rest of us. So I owe a lot of thanks to her. And then nowadays, the height requirement and the weight requirement is 120 pounds to 200 pounds, and that's dry weight, and 5 foot to 6'5". So back in the day, I would have had a problem with the height, but not the weight. I'm good there. I'm packing 155. All right, next slide. Kim Maynard, I love her. She was the very first female to rookie out of Missoula. And she's the very first female to be a squad leader in the jump program in the United States. She is quite a hoot. There's an article published on her, and it was called Wild Nights in Tequila. It was kind of her experience on the fire line being a female. But she rookied in 1982. These websites, if you're interested, are really great. The Smokey Generation is a oral history project that Bethany Hanna has composed, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you here are part of that oral history. Did any of you guys volunteer for that? Okay. Well, I know there's a lot of guys back in their era that did. So Bethany Hanna is doing her master's on an oral history project, and it's just not Smokejumpers, but it's all of firefighters. So it's a really interesting thing. And Kim Maynard's on there, and so am I. So it's about my really ridiculous story about how I lost a chute in the river. It's pretty funny. Yeah, we'll get to that later. But yeah, Kim Maynard, she's a great lady. And the next slide. This is her volunteering for the in the Wilderness for the Trails project. So, and she's retired now, and she works all over with natural disasters. She keeps herself pretty busy. So I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't want to take up Boyd's time, but time for questions later. Thanks, guys.
Hi, I'm Boyd Burtch. Currently the loadmaster foreman at the Missoula base here. Started in 1988, and originally was going to just do it for 7 years, but got the bug, and now I can work on my retirement, so got to the end of that. So, but anyway, I just realized the other day that the first time I flew in a plane was I jumped out of it, so it's probably like a lot of these guys that first time you fly, you jump out, so that's kind of the normal process. But this DC-3 here, just a little current information, all the bases. There's like 7 Forest Service bases, Missoula, West Yellowstone, Grangeville, Idaho, McCall, Idaho, was it Redding, California, Redmond, Oregon, and North Cascade, Washington. So, and there's 2 Force or BLM bases, which is Boise and Alaska. And so we all, out of the 300 smoke jumpers that are in the system, we rotate around to where the most activity is during the summertime. And generally in the Northern Rockies here is from July till end of September into October. In the first part of the years, we'll work our way down to New Mexico, Silver City, New Mexico. We'll be down there in May through July, and then also Alaska is one of the earlier parts of the fire season. Generally, though, our fire season was used to be around the core time from July. Now we're actually working pretty much year-round at the base. We got wildland fire and prescribed fire down in Region 8, which is the southeast corner of the U.S., which is we send guys down there for 21-day tours, and they come back, and work isn't hard, and it's get a little overtime, which now is kind of one of the things is a lot of people like a lot of overtime, so it helps them get through school and get through day-to-day stuff. So, and currently this is a picture of the DC-3. I'll go to the next slide. And this is inside the DC-3. DC-3 holds like 16 smoke jumpers for operationally during the fire season. Then we have other planes. The other planes we jump out of are the Otter, the Twin Otter, and you'll probably have seen those flying around, and the Sherpas. It's more of like a boxy plane. And the Doorknob, which is a much faster plane, but it's they all hold 8 jumpers. And last one is the Casa, which holds 8 jumpers, and it's a boxy plane also. So canopy-wise, you want to go to the next slide? All right. Generally, where we do make our bread and butter actually is the smaller fires. So a plane load of jumpers would jump this fire, or at the minimum two jumpers to 8, depends on the size of the fire. But the idea is to jump it sooner when it's a smaller fire, big as this room, big as this table. Then we can put them out and get to them quickly and put them out so they're small and don't become, next slide, stuff like this where we have the, generally fires like this, you're going to end up with a lot more folks live on the edge of town. Urban interface is one of our big things that we have nowadays is folks, these big fires like this threaten homes. And so it's just one of those things. If you get them small, you don't have this issue. And most of the time during the summer, probably 5% of the fires are this big, and you hear about them all the time. But most of the fires that we jump, like last year we jumped, 30 fires last year? And probably only heard about maybe 3 or 4 of those fires. So most of the fires you don't hear about them because they're so small and taken care of quickly. All right, go to the next. All right, this is a little clip of some square jumpers jumping out of the DC-3 on a practice jump. So they'll sit down and they'll just flop right out of the plane. This is a 3-person stick. 3 jumpers will go at a time. And generally, I just realized also most of our planes have cameras on them, so probably new guys, new jumpers now, through their entire career, they'll probably have a picture for every exit they do, every landing they do. Go ahead and go to the next one. So this is the landing of a DC or a square canopy. And all these practice jumps we do are local. These are Missoula practice jumps, and actually, just so you know, that for the next month and a half, we're going to have a lot of practice jumps out at the airport. So this is a ram air canopy, which is this canopy back here. And generally, they have a forward speed of 20 miles an hour, but you can slow them down to so that you just slide right onto the ground. And this, the next little clip is two round jumpers out by the airport.
And Haig.
So 2 good rolls, a lot of PLFs there, parachute landing falls. So we got the square canopy and the round canopies, and we're transitioning from the round. So it's all part of the evolution of smoke jumping. You saw the Eagle chute earlier, and then the FS-14 through the chutes. Different years, every 10 years we change a chute, and so now we're onto the square, which has a higher forward speed, and you end up actually jumping out. You can jump more folks at a time, which is nice. And we get a private company will make the chutes, but we do all the repairs, we do all the rigging, all the packing, and so that's pretty much. So that's pretty much it. So I think there's another picture, no. And we have one more thing. Lowe's wants to come up again. Stand by.
Yeah, I'm going to start over. What I want to announce is the amount of time one person and his wife put into this project. Excuse me. You get a phone call. You recognize the voice. It says, "This is Barry," and you wonder, what did I just volunteer for? But you'll find out 30 seconds later. Oh, no, he says that's enough, but it's important that all the work that he put in, and I think it should. Okay. One other quick thing. When they have the young lady smoke jumper, I was a chief foreman in 1980.
More stories here.
It's a short. And this is what, I was on a fire, and then the next thing when I came back in, I was called into the aviation fire management office. I was called in an office of personnel and one of the assistant foresters because somebody said we didn't make smoke jumper suits small enough for women, and they didn't like that.
Okay, we do have time for questions, and Dennis has a mic that he would pass around to anybody that wants to ask a question.
Well, I've been waiting a long time for this, especially with Bud Clarke sitting here. My name is Jim Labby. I was born and raised here in the Bonner area. Went to work for the Forest Service as a ground pounder up at Seeley Lake in 1957. Went into fire dispatching at Bonita in 1962. And anyway, I spent about 15, 18 years dispatching fires. Dispatching, I don't know, I probably dispatched Bud Clarke, I don't know how many different times. But anyway, dispatching is a very important part of the whole fire suppression activity. Whenever I had a fire, I needed jumpers, retardant, or whatever. I had to go to the AFD, to Charlie Rogers, and request, whatever it was I needed. It was in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, I can't remember. We had a fire up Lowell Creek, about, 6 or 8 miles up Lowell Creek. No air tankers in Missoula. They had Tanker 10 in West Yellowstone, which was a B-17. So we ordered Air Tanker 10 out of West Yellowstone, loaded, came and dropped on the fire up Lowell Creek. In the meantime, we had a fire just this side of Superior, and I had ordered a Doug loaded jumper, 16 jumpers for that fire. It was too windy. They couldn't jump. Tanker 10 then reloaded in Missoula, went out to drop on that fire at Superior, and for whatever reason, he was flying up canyon. Anyway, the tanker crashed. Of course, started another fire, killed both pilots. Well, the Doug is still circling around up there with 16 jumpers on board. And Charlie Rogers called me on the phone and said, "Hey, Labby, did you hear what I just heard?" I said, "Yeah." By the time we were done with our discussion there, those 16 jumpers were on the ground, wind or no wind. They jumped. And anyway, that's the positive side of the smoke jumpers. I don't know how many fires that I put jumpers on, whatever, but that was just a positive thing, for the jumpers that.
So the key is the dispatching was a key part of the program, and there's another one sitting right over there too, Jim. So.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
I'm Stan Cohen. I guess I know most of the people here. I'm the executive director of the Museum of Mountain Flying out at the airport. I'm sure most of you have been there. Just to let you know that sometime in June, the Travel Channel on the, I don't know if that's the History Channel or what, we're going to be on national TV. They spent an outfit out of New York in September, spent a couple days with us talking about the Mann Gulch airplane and interviewed me for an hour about Mann Gulch, which I had to really study up on. So we'll be open Memorial Day weekend clear through the summer. And I'd say I spent 6 summers with the Forest Service from Alaska, Oregon, and Montana, and I would have jumped out of an airplane, but I get a nosebleed sitting in a barber chair, so.
Thanks, Dan.
We hadn't gotten to a question yet, have we, Dennis?
Jim Hobbick, I recall about 15 or 20 years ago that the first switchover from the round chute to some kind of
sports chute, rectangular, came to a dead end, literally, because the smoke jumper who was the first testing that rectangular chute failed to pull the ripcord, and he fell to his death. Is that correct, or what time?
Yeah, that did happen back in '91. Billy Martin did have did not pull his main canopy that time. Right now, we have reserves with automatic opening devices on them, so that happening again, or very slim chance that would happen again.
It slowed up the switchover.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yes,
did.
it did. BLM stayed on their square chutes, but the Forest Service stopped, and they developed the FS-14 canopy, and it took several years before we could try the square again.
Has there ever been a female jumper that has died in line of duty?
No, there has not been.
Other questions?
I don't need the microphone. I think I can shout. Thank you, Dennis. I would like to ask Roger if the Seeley Lake training area is the same airport that's there now, or was that at a different spot? For Seeley Lake training area.
Could you say that question again, please?
Was the training area at Seeley Lake and formerly used for training of smoke jumpers? Is that the... Give him the mic.
The Seeley Lake... Yeah. The Seeley Lake training occurred just in the first few years of smoke jumping, and then it transitioned more over to the 9 Mile area, and eventually in '54 the parachute jumps that Boyd was showing were right across the airport from the area fire depot, the jumper base there.
Oh, okay. So that's not at the same location as the current Seeley Lake Airport, then.
Well, I think the airport's the same place as it was back then. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Other questions?
Okay, no, it's not where the airport is now. It was on the north end of Seeley Lake, on the west side. There was an airstrip in there, and that was the airstrip that the Forest Service used way before the new airport. Yeah, it's off Boy Scout Road. Yep.
I stand corrected.
I want to thank all of the men and women who have kept our forests safe for us. As part of the timber industry, we know here in Bonner how important that is, and even back as recently as 2011 when it was coming right behind my house. I certainly appreciate all of the firefighting that has occurred and all of the innovations that are taking place. As you can see, it is time for our program to end and transition to a pasty dinner. The kitchen is ready, and I invite you all to enjoy that. And also remember that the concert at the Lutheran Church is going to start at 4:30. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our program.